If you would have told me years ago that I would be in a back and forth YouTube debate with Gavin Ortlund on Marian apparitions at Zeitoun, I don't think I would have believed you. But today I am responding to Gavin's response to my argument that the Marian apparitions at Zeitoun provide better evidence for Christianity than even the resurrection. And surprisingly, there are several things that he and I actually agree on. But of course, there are also some pretty big disagreements. So in this video, I'm going to walk through 3 key areas where we agree, and then break down 4 major points of disagreement. And then finally, I'm going to leave Gavin with a challenge that I think he should deeply consider. So let's start where Gavin and I agree. Number 1, we agree that it was supernatural. So Gavin acknowledges that something supernatural happened at Zeitoun. He says this:
it really looks like something supernatural is going on at Zeitoun. And so I can appreciate where Cameron wants to push back against those who just dismiss all of the possibility of this. There's a lot of eyewitnesses. Some of them are really credible, like high-level clergy verifying these events. There are also secular individuals and secular groups that are saying there is no naturalistic explanation for this. We don't know how to explain this.
So I completely agree with this. The sheer number of eyewitnesses, photographs, and government reports confirm that what happened at Zeitoun wasn't just some mass delusion or trick of the light. If skeptics want to dismiss Zeitoun, they have to explain how thousands of people, many of them non-Christians, saw the same thing over multiple years. The second area of agreement between Gavin and I is that neither of us is actually convinced that Zeitoun was demonic. Now, to be fair, Gavin does say that we should exercise discernment in this area. Let's watch what he says.
I think Cameron has a fair argument in principle that spiritual fruit reveals a good tree. So he's saying, look, there's miracles and there's genuine conversions here. The reason I'm still a little just saying not fully on board yet, but open and sympathetic to this argument, but just wanting, I basically just need more information, is because when you hear reports of people seeing the apparition of Mary at Zeitoun and remaining a Muslim, it raises this question, and that's, what are we really talking about here in terms of spiritual fruit? How do we distinguish just a rush of excitement from true conversions to the true gospel? But since I just don't have enough information about that, let me just say, look, a Protestant can just follow the evidence. If this episode did really result in genuine spiritual fruits like conversions to the true gospel, then it is from God. I think we should say that. Whether it's an angel or Mary or whatever it might be, again, we can just follow the evidence.
Again, I agree. I think we should be exercising caution and discernment in this area. Now, I also agree that Protestants should be following the evidence on this, so I encourage Gavin and others who are interested to look into the documented miracles associated with Zeitoun. Jerome Palmer's short book, Our Lady Returns to Egypt, is a really good place to start if you're interested. The third area of agreement is that it doesn't prove any one denomination. So Gavin argues that Zeitoun doesn't prove Catholicism, Orthodoxy, or any particular branch of Christianity. Here's how he puts it.
The Zeitoun event is not ecclesially determinative. What I mean by that is, however you interpret this, whatever you think happened, it doesn't promote one branch of Christianity over another.
Once again, I agree. The apparitions don't come with a doctrinal statement or a list of denominational requirements. Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, even Muslims witness the event. So while Zeitoun undeniably supports Christianity, it doesn't settle every theological debate within Christianity. So that's 3 big points of agreement between Gavin and me, but our agreement only goes so far. Now let's get into the points where he and I don't see eye to eye, starting with the biggest one of all. Disagreement number 1. Is the resurrection evidence stronger? Gavin states this:
the Zeitoun event is not greater proof of Christianity than the resurrection. The disciples had lived with Jesus for several years. They knew exactly what he looked like. He appears to them many, many times over more than a month. Acts chapter 1, verse 3 says he gave many proofs for a period of about 40 days. That's the time between the resurrection and the ascension. And he's talking to them at point-blank range on many different occasions. He's, telling them to touch his body for the specific purpose of recognizing his identity.
So now let's look at the actual evidence that we have for each of these events. All right, let's start with the evidence for the resurrection. The accounts of Jesus' resurrection primarily come from John and Matthew, eyewitnesses, but writing around 30 to 65 years later. This also assumes traditional authorship. Paul, an eyewitness to his own experience, but not to Easter or the group appearances that he reports. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is very early, but maximalists argue that it doesn't rule out natural explanations. Mark, Luke, and Acts are not eyewitnesses. They're hearsay accounts, technically, reporting what others said that they saw. Even in 1 Corinthians 15, the 500 witnesses are mentioned, but not a single name is provided. No individual testimony, no follow-up accounts, no statistical analysis of what each person actually saw. Now let's look at the evidence for Zeitoun. There are thousands of eyewitness reports, including named individuals, documented immediately. We have multiple independent statistical surveys detailing what eyewitnesses saw, photographs confirming the apparition, investigations from secular sources, including the Egyptian government, which confirmed that there was no natural explanation. All right, now let's bring in some direct eyewitness testimony. If you've never heard what people are actually reporting seeing, you're about to find out. And it's really cool. This is really fascinating stuff. So Bishop Gregorius, a high-ranking Coptic authority, personally observed the apparitions and described what he saw. Quote, Saint Mary appeared in many different forms since April 2nd, 1968. She is still appearing from time to time. January 1969. She stood there for as much as 2 or 3 hours in the same spot. People who went to Zeitoun on Saturday, May 4 at 9 p.m. saw her in radiance until 5 a.m. On Sunday, May 5th. For 8 hours, she was visible to thousands and thousands of people. I was there myself that night. Most of those present were Muslims. Or consider Mr. and Mrs. Wady Shumbo. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. They were Protestant evangelical leaders in Egypt at the time. Quote, I have seen the Virgin. I tell you, I have seen her in full body. I have not seen shadows. Thousands and thousands of people, 50, 100,000 from villages and towns around put their sheets on the street and sang hymns to the Virgin. Lastly, consider, quote, Muhammad Hassan and Shahida Mansour, Muslims who also described what they saw. Mr. Hassan is an employee of the Cairo Optical Company. These two went together to Zeitoun, but did not really expect to see anything. That's going to be important later on. So they didn't expect to see anything. They went only because they had heard others speaking of the marvel. About 3 a.m. on the third night, they went out to the church and they saw a figure brilliantly clothed in white, about half a league above the roof between two of the domes. 3 different times they were able to see St. Mary. It was no shadow, reflection, no artifact. It was the Virgin. She was glorious. She was not stationary. She moved and the people shouted, We witness to you, St. Mary. We believe in you, St. Mary. She bowed her head and moved her hands. Her features could not be distinguished as the light was too bright. She wore a crown that shone like diamonds, all of light. Now, these are just a handful of the eyewitness accounts that we have access to. What's clear, though, is that Zeitoun was a multiple-year, repeatable event seen by skeptics, Muslims, Protestants, and secular investigators alike. In fact, we have so much eyewitness testimony that we have multiple independent surveys verifying the consistency of these reports. Consider the sort of famous Jackson survey from 1986. Quote, when asked about the appearance of the apparition, 90% of 83 respondents reported that the apparition looked like human with a definite shape. Indeed, 92% of 48 respondents claimed that human features were discernible in the apparition, with 49% out of 61 respondents reportedly seeing its hands, while 10% saw its feet. In another survey of 22 eyewitness accounts conducted by Musso in her book Marian Apparitions in Cultural Context, she reports on page 74 of her book, quote, once the apparition had manifested from the luminous light into a form or figure, it appeared as a female. In fact, a strong majority, or 77% of the people in the sample, identify the figure as the religious Mary, Mother of Jesus. 50% identified the apparition as either the Virgin or the Blessed Virgin. 41% had identified it as Saint Mary or Mary, as well as Our Lady and Blessed Mother, with 18% and 14% respectively. So not only are these eyewitnesses identifying the apparition as female, they're also identifying it as Saint Mary. Now, on top of all of this, we even have numerous contemporary newspaper accounts, and I won't keep these on the screen very long, so just pause the video and read some of these if you want. Think about this. If we had this level of documentation for the resurrection, it would be game over for skepticism. We'd have thousands of named eyewitnesses. We'd have photographs. We'd have surveys verifying their testimony. But for the resurrection, we don't have any of that. And we'll get to Gavin's objection about recognizability in a moment. But for now, the raw evidence overwhelmingly favors Zeitoun as the more well-attested event. Now, at this point, it seems like Gavin, along with many others, sort of conflate two separate ideas. One, the theological significance of an event, like how important an event is within Christianity, and two, the evidential weight of an event, how well attested that event actually is. Now, this is where I think a lot of people are getting tripped up. They assume that because the resurrection is more theologically significant in Christianity, which it is, it must therefore have the strongest evidence. But that's just not how evidence works. Let's use an analogy. Okay, someone's birth is the most important event in their life. It's literally like how they came into existence. But does that mean that we have more evidence for their birth than for their current existence? Not necessarily. We might have photos and videos and driver's licenses and daily interactions that confirm their existence today, but for their birth, maybe we only have like their birth certificate, maybe just some sort of secondhand testimony from people who might have been there at their birth. But that doesn't mean that they weren't born. It just means that we naturally accumulate more immediate direct evidence for more recent events. And that is what's happening with Zeitoun versus the resurrection. The resurrection is theologically unmatched. Like, it's the foundation of Christian hope. Zeitoun, on the other hand, has more immediate evidence simply because it happened in front of more people in an era where we could document it better. So if Gavin is arguing that the resurrection's evidence has to be stronger because it's more theologically significant, he's actually making a category error. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that he's actually doing this. I'm just saying, like, if he's arguing this way, he's making a category error. Because as we just saw, when we actually compare the quality and quantity of evidence, Zeitoun wins by a mile. Now, I have to remind you, this does not mean that the resurrection evidence is bad. I'm not saying that the resurrection evidence is weak. I'm just saying that we have even better evidence for Zeitoun, which is unproblematic. All right, disagreement number 2, were Muslims actually predisposed to see Mary? So Gavin argues that the Muslims in Egypt may have been predisposed to interpret the Zeitoun apparition as Mary because of their reverence for her in Islam. He states this.
According to Nelson, the Virgin symbolizes for the Egyptians, both Christians and Muslims alike, a succoring, protective mother, the great prototype of the universal human experience who has the power to banish chaos and restore the benign shape of the world. And then she records the testimony of one Muslim who stated that she had seen the apparition, who spoke of an expectation among Muslims for Marian visitation. So Muslims in Egypt would not necessarily be disinclined to believe in a Marian apparition. You can totally imagine, if word gets around that there's an apparition of Mary, both local Muslims and Christians can get very excited about this. Cameron mentioned that the first 2 people to see her were Muslims, but they didn't think it was Mary. The first 2 people, they were bus mechanics, look up and see this woman. They thought it was just some woman who's going to commit suicide by jumping off the building. And so they're shouting at her to not jump. And it's only after they start doing this and a crowd forms that the church custodian suggested it was Mary. And then and this excites the crowd. And then from that time going forward, it becomes this huge event and everybody's talking about it. And so this is a crucial difference. The people coming to Zeitoun have heard about a Marian apparition there. Many are coming, doubtless, hoping to see her. Contrast that with someone like Paul, seeing the risen Christ. In his book on the resurrection, N.T. Wright argues that a bodily resurrection in the middle of history is not what the first century Jews were expecting. What Paul encountered of the risen Christ would have been his worst nightmare, not something he could possibly have anticipated. Certainly not something he was coming to investigate.
Now, Gavin is actually making a really subtle but important point here. He's not just saying that Muslims respect Mary. He's arguing that once people start claiming that they see her, that belief sort of snowballs and others become more likely to interpret lights or vague shapes as Mary simply because that's what they would expect. This is what we might call social reinforcement bias. The idea that the crowd's sort of collective excitement makes it easier for people to see what they want to see. That sounds plausible, but there are actually several major problems with this claim. So problem 1, the first witnesses didn't expect Mary at all. This is actually a really big issue for Gavin's claim. If Zeitoun were fueled by predisposition from the outset, then the first witnesses should have recognized Mary immediately, but that's not what happened. The first people to see the apparition were Muslim mechanics. And what was their reaction? Did they cry out, "It's the Virgin Mary"? No, they actually thought it was a suicidal nun about to jump off of the church roof, and then they started shouting for her not to jump. This means that the earliest and most direct encounter with the apparition was not immediately interpreted as Mary. In fact, it was only after someone else suggested it was Mary that the crowd's perception started to shift. Now, I realize that Gavin, this was like part of his point, right? But my point is that a sort of general disposition to see Mary did not exist at that time in that region. This is part of my cumulative response to Gavin here. But the problems don't stop here. All right, problem number 2. If this undermines Zeitoun, it also undermines the resurrection. Gavin suggests that if people are already predisposed to see Mary, then we shouldn't really trust their testimonies as much. But if that's the standard, then what happens to the resurrection? The disciples already had heard Jesus predict his resurrection. Matthew 16:21, Mark 8:31. Paul also had been persecuting Christians and knew all about their claims before his conversion. By Gavin's logic, the fact that people had prior knowledge of Jesus' resurrection should make their testimony unreliable or less trustworthy. But of course, we don't accept that reasoning for the resurrection, so why should we accept it for Zeitoun? Problem number 3, Muslims don't expect Marian apparitions. Yes, Muslims respect Mary, but they do not have a tradition of her appearing in visions, blessing crowds, or performing miracles. Islam denies that Mary plays an intercessory role or that she should be venerated the way that Catholics think that she should. So if predisposition was really at work here, especially after people started to identify her as Mary, why did Mary appear over a Coptic church, not a mosque? Why didn't she appear in a way that aligns with Islamic beliefs? Why would a crowd of Muslims suddenly expect a Christian-style Marian apparition when Islam has no precedent for that? Problem number 4, Protestants saw her too. So even if we grant that some Muslims may have had a kind of predisposition toward honoring Mary, that doesn't explain why Protestant evangelicals also saw her. Mr. and Mrs. Wadi Shumbo, prominent Protestant leaders in Egypt, reported seeing a full-body apparition of Mary. They had every reason to dismiss Zeitoun as fake, but they couldn't. If Zeitoun was really about religious expectations, why did even skeptical Protestants report seeing the same thing? Problem number 5, and this is a pretty serious one. This actually contradicts Gavin's next argument. So in this argument, he's saying that people were so ready to see Mary that they projected her identity onto this sort of glowing figure, this glowing apparition. But he's also argued in his video that the figure was hard to identify. So which is it? If people were predisposed, then they should have had no trouble identifying the apparition immediately. But if identification was actually difficult, then predisposition wasn't decisive in shaping what people saw. So Gavin's argument here actually cuts against itself. Either predisposition explains Zeitoun, or the apparition was hard to identify. He can't have it both ways. And this brings us to our next disagreement. All right, let's move on to disagreement number 3. Was it easier to identify Jesus? Now, one of Gavin's main arguments in his video is that the resurrection appearances of Jesus were stronger because the disciples knew exactly what he looked like and interacted with him at close range and even talked with him, spoke with him and stuff. So here's what Gavin says.
The disciples had lived with Jesus for several years. They knew exactly what he looked like. He appears to them many, many times over more than a month. Acts chapter 1, verse 3 says he gave many proofs for a period of about 40 days. That's the time between the resurrection and the ascension. And he's talking to them at point blank range on many different occasions. He's, telling them to touch his body for the specific purpose of recognizing his identity. In contrast, at Zeitoun, the figure that is purported to be Mary does not say a word. There's over this roughly 3-year period, there's not a single word that she says. She's seen at a distance on the top of a roof, and she is only ever seen at night.
Now, this might sound compelling at first, but it actually really overstates the case. Number 1, Jesus wasn't always easily recognized. If Jesus' post-resurrection appearances were so easy to identify, then why did multiple people fail to recognize him at first? So Mary Magdalene mistook him for a gardener in John 20:14-15. The disciples on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize him in Luke 24:13-16. And then the disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee didn't know it was him at first in John 21:4. So clearly Jesus' resurrected body was not instantly recognizable, even to those who had spent years with him. Number 2, biblical figures have recognized people they've never seen before. Gavin claims that recognizing Mary is harder because no one had ever seen her before. But this argument proves way too much here, because there are biblical examples of people recognizing spiritual or supernatural individuals that they had never seen before. The disciples identified Elijah and Moses at the Transfiguration in Luke 9:30-33, despite never having seen them before. So if biblical figures can recognize supernatural figures that they've never seen, then there's not really much reason to assume that Zeitoun witnesses couldn't recognize Mary, especially given the clear Marian symbols associated with the apparition. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, number 3, alternative identities were ruled out. Zeitoun wasn't just some random glowing figure. There were specific, repeated elements that pointed directly to Mary. It appeared above a church dedicated to Mary. The first witnesses thought it was a nun, which aligns with traditional Marian imagery. The apparition blessed the crowd when they called out to her as Mary. The figure held an olive branch, a well-known Marian symbol. The figure held the Christ child at times, further reinforcing her identity. It wasn't a demon, Matthew 12:25-26. The event brought healings, conversions, and acts of faith in Christ. And it wasn't an angel. Angels in the Bible always correct mistaken identity, yet this apparition never did over the course of many years. So Gavin is right that it's easier to recognize someone that you've seen before, but that's not the whole story. The resurrected Jesus wasn't always recognized immediately, and the Bible includes multiple examples of supernatural recognition. Given the very strong Marian symbols at Zeitoun, there's more than enough reason to believe that the apparition was Mary, especially if you think that it was supernatural. But there's a key distinction that often gets overlooked here. There's a crucial difference between the data that an event occurred and the explanation of that data. When Gavin argues that Jesus was clearly recognized in the resurrection appearances, he's making a claim about the best explanation of the biblical data. And I've responded to that in at least 2 ways. So first, I've said the best explanation of Zeitoun is Mary, just as Gavin argues that the best explanation of the biblical accounts is Jesus. So the resurrection has no inherent advantage when it comes to explanation. Now, second, I've argued that the raw data supporting Zeitoun is vastly superior. We're not dealing with a handful of late written testimonies. We have thousands of contemporaneous eyewitness reports, independent statistical analyses verifying those reports. We have secular government investigations confirming that there was no natural explanation, photographs of the event, and of the eyewitnesses themselves. We don't have any of this for the resurrection. So in terms of explanations, Zeitoun and the resurrection are actually on equal footing. But in terms of the raw data, Zeitoun has a clear upper hand. And this is why I keep making the claim that the evidence for Zeitoun is stronger. And again, this is not to say that the evidence for the resurrection is weak. It's rather to say that we have even stronger evidence for Zeitoun, which we do, which should actually be really good. Like, this is awesome that we have such good evidence for the truth of Christianity at Zeitoun. Everyone should welcome this. And that actually brings me to disagreement number 4. Does Zeitoun have theological significance? Now, this actually shocked me when I first heard this from Gavin. Gavin argues that even if we accept the event as supernatural, it doesn't have any theological implications. This is exactly what he says.
We don't have a particular church's theology being advocated here at this event. In fact, we don't have any theology being advocated. But this claim, and I have to be blunt about this is obviously false. If Zeitoun was truly an apparition of Mary, it has enormous theological implications, whether Gavin wants to acknowledge them or not. So first, it refutes soul sleep. Many Protestants, particularly Seventh-day Adventists, believe in soul sleep, the idea that the dead remain unconscious until the final resurrection. But if Mary appeared at Zeitoun, then she was clearly conscious and active in the present. This alone debunks soul sleep. Number 2, it refutes cessationism. Cessationism is the belief that miracles and supernatural revelations ceased after the apostolic age. But Zeitoun was a public, repeatable, and verifiable supernatural event that occurred in modern history with photographs and government confirmation. If Gavin accepts that something supernatural happened, then he and everyone else must acknowledge that cessationism is false. Number 3, it supports the communion of saints. If Mary appeared at Zeitoun, that means that saints in heaven can be aware of events on earth and can even manifest to the living. This actually aligns perfectly with the Catholic and Orthodox view of the communion of saints, where the faithful in heaven remain sort of active participants in the church, but it directly contradicts theologies that reject such interactions.
Fourth, it supports a kind of Marian devotion. Mary didn't just appear anywhere. She appeared above a church dedicated to her. She was seen blessing the crowd and holding the Christ child. The event deepened Marian devotion worldwide, drawing crowds of Christians and Muslims alike to honor her. And let's remember, if the Mother of God is appearing and blessing people, it's probably a pretty good idea to pay attention. And then fifth, it reinforces the incarnation. One of the most powerful images from Zeitoun was Mary holding Jesus. And this is deeply theological because it visually reaffirms the incarnation. Jesus was truly born of a woman. Mary was truly his mother. The Son of God took on human flesh. And this is especially significant in an Islamic context where the incarnation is denied. So here's the bottom line, all right? Gavin claims that Zeitoun carries no theological implications, something he actually says, but that is simply not true. If it really was Mary, then several, mostly Protestant, doctrines are false. If it was Mary, then the communion of saints is real. And if it was Mary, then at least some level of Marian devotion is valid. All right, here is my final challenge to Gavin, and here's where things stand right now. So we both agree that Zeitoun was supernatural. Neither of us are convinced that it was demonic. And then we both agree that thousands of people, including skeptics, Muslims, and Protestants, witnessed the same event. But Gavin, despite all of this, you've tried to argue that the evidence for the resurrection is stronger, that Zeitoun involved predisposed witnesses, that the identity of Mary is less certain than Jesus, and that Zeitoun carries no theological import. We've walked through every single one of these claims, and they simply don't hold up. The evidence for Zeitoun is far superior. Thousands of contemporaneous eyewitnesses, photographs, government investigations, newspaper reports, and statistical analyses. The predisposition argument collapses. The first witnesses were Muslims with no Marian expectation, and even Protestant leaders confirmed what they saw. The identification of Mary is no less certain than the identification of Jesus, and we can't forget that the raw data for Zeitoun has much better attestation. And then lastly, theological implications are absolutely unavoidable. If Zeitoun really was Mary appearing, then cessationism is false, soul sleep is false, and then certain views of the saints are also false. So here is the ultimate question. Who appeared at Zeitoun? If it wasn't a hallucination, if it wasn't a hoax, if it wasn't demonic, who was it? If you're willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, then I think we all know the answer.